Welcome to Central Park. My name is Ian. Thank you so much. We have over 300 visitors with us today. So wherever you're tuning in from, we're very grateful to have you joining us today. We here at the Central Park Conservancy recognize that unfortunately, many people cannot make it to Central Park right now. So we're bringing the park to you through our virtual programming. And today we'll be taking a lunchtime stroll to Fort Fish, which is a landscape in the northern end of the park. It's a chilly day in January, so get on your scarves, your winter jackets, because we're gonna go enjoy nature regardless of the temperature. We'll be together for about 15 minutes today, and all the photographs you'll see were taken by myself just a few days ago. I've also added some historical images to this walk, and I will cite those sources as they appear on the screen. And our mission at the Central Park Conservancy is to preserve and celebrate Central Park as a sanctuary from the pace and pressures of city life, enhancing the enjoyment and well-being of all. So wherever you're tuning in from, I hope that this short walk gives you a nice break in the middle of your day from whatever pressures or whatever the pace of your day looks like. So we'll be getting into the walk shortly. Please bear with me for a few minutes because I have some housekeeping to go through very quickly. If you have not used Zoom before, you can use the control bar on your screen if you'd like to participate in today's walk, which I hope that you do. There's a chat feature you can use to say hello. Once again, we have 346 people in the webinar right now. So please say hello, share where you're from if you'd like. And if you have a specific question, colleagues Swan and Ryan are on the back end, so you can ask them on the using the Q&A feature. And I'll also share a poll during the walk that you'll see pop up on your screen. And the last bit of my housekeeping are some announcements. Firstly, we have upcoming programs that you should check out, and my colleagues will drop the links to those programs in the chat. Next week, we have another weekly walk, and that will be of Seneca Village, which is an important chapter in the history of New York that takes place in the land that is now Central Park, so you should check that out. It's going to be a shorter program. If you'd like a longer program concerning Seneca Village, we have that coming up on Tuesday, February 9th, which will be a 45-minute long program. And we also have next Tuesday a virtual tour called Crossing Central Park. So you can check all of those out. All of those links will be in the chat. And lastly, once again, I promise this will not affect the length of the walk. Don't worry, but I have to make an announcement that due to unforeseen circumstances, today's program, Treasures from the Library, The Origins of Central Park, has been canceled. If you don't know what I'm talking about, there was another virtual program this afternoon that was scheduled, and unfortunately, we have had to reschedule this to Wednesday, February 24th at 3 p.m. Both the Central Park Conservancy and the New York Historical Society apologize for this unfortunate inconvenience. All tickets have automatically been moved to the new date. You will receive a new Zoom link shortly. And if you're unable to attend the new date for this program, if you were signed up, there's another program that's going to be taking place on March 31st called Treasures from the Library, Touring Central Park in the 19th Century. So if you would prefer to have your ticket moved to that program, you can't make the new rescheduled date, please email your request to programs@centralparknyc.org. Once again, if you are signed up for this program and you'd prefer this different date, you can write to programs@centralparknyc.org. I know that was a mouthful. If this applies to you, you will be getting an email about it, so don't worry, you'll see all that information. And once again, we apologize for that inconvenience. All right, thank you for bearing with me. I know that was a lot, but we're getting into the walk now. So once again, get your hats on because it's a chilly day here in Central Park. On the left of our screen, we got a view of the entire park, the long rectangle that we all know and love. And I've outlined the section that we'll be walking around today We'll be entering on the east side on 5th Avenue and East 106th Street. And we're visiting this landscape because we haven't come here on our virtual programming in a while, actually. The last time we were at Fort Fish was back in July when my colleague Brendan led a walk, a much greener, warmer walk to this area. And so I'm coming here partly to show how the park changes every day throughout the seasons, which is one of the beautiful things about the park, but also to explore some history that we haven't touched on. And so I will be talking about the fort briefly during this walk, but it'll be a short stop, whereas Brendan had done a walk that went into great detail about the different forts in this landscape. So if that sounds like something that interests you, you can check out his YouTube video that my colleagues will link you to. We will be exploring some other points of history in more detail, and coming to the park, is the best way to learn about new landscapes by exploring on your own. Of course, you can read. I think reading about your immediate surroundings really adds a lot of joy to your life as you understand the history of it a bit more. But one thing that I really love to do in Central Park, this is like the history nerd in me coming out, is looking at old maps. There are a lot of old maps of Central Park. Of course, it was a designed landscape, so that's the first map that you'll see is the design of Central Park. But there were many subsequent maps that came out, some for like technical reasons, like topographical maps. Then there's a lot geared towards visitors, and these tend to be the ones with the most beautiful illustrations. As you can imagine, they're geared to residents or visitors. And this is one of my favorites. This is an 1873 map from that was commissioned by the New York City Parks Department, and it's beautifully illustrated. But what's really fun about this, I think, is looking at it in with a close eye and trying to recognize the things that have changed about the park. So if you're not as familiar with this landscape, maybe you won't recognize it. But if you are, take a look at this and see. We're at East 106th Street, and there are some things on this map that are no longer in the park, and some changes that have been made as well. And there are a bunch of changes, really, but the most glaring is that this campus of buildings that's labeled Mount St. Vincent is no longer here. And we're going to be exploring that today. And you also see a temporary nursery propagating an exotic garden down here, which is where today's conservatory garden is located. So it's some big changes. And if we look at today's map, we have more beautiful maps that we use, but this is a pretty practical one that we share with visitors. Here, I'll flip back to the other one. And you can kind of see how most of the paths and the drive are the same, but those buildings are gone, and there are some cosmetic changes, like some baseball fields that were added and some recreational facilities added, with Alaska rink and pool. And I'll share that old map one more time. I think if you love Central Park, I would encourage you to go to the New York Public Library website where you can find this map, look at it in more detail, and you can try to test yourself to see what things have changed and the extent to which you can recognize those changes. So I did want to launch a poll here to ask you how familiar you are with Central Park's geography. Maybe you aren't familiar with it at all, and I'm glad that you're joining us to learn about it, but some of you may have a lot of familiarity with the park. And once again, maybe you want to go and check out some of these old maps, and you can really test yourself. It's pretty fun to do, but once again, I am a little bit of a nerd, so maybe it appeals to nerds like me a bit more. But anyway, we'll begin our walk here. Once again, it's cold. We're at East 106th Street and 5th Avenue. Here's 5th Avenue. Actually a really beautiful part of the street up here, lined with trees, which kind of acts as a border between the urban and the park landscape. And we're entering here. You may have noticed on the map, this entrance wasn't here. This is another thing that was added just as residential development moved up in Manhattan, and there was a greater need for entrances to the park. So that's why this is here. And as we're walking through the park, we'll first be greeted by this banner that says The trees, flowers, and wildlife all give me peace. And this was a comment from one of our visitors, Mary. And even in January, you can see, well, you can definitely see a lot of trees, fewer flowers, but there's certainly wildlife to see if you're able to make it to the park. Some things are a bit different in the winter. For example, a lot of our lawns are closed, which is a necessity for their upkeep. And if you visit the park in the warmer months, you'll be amazed at how well kept our lawns are. But a lot of that can be attributed to measures like this that make it that take care of the landscape. So those will open back up when it becomes warm. And you can see just how cold it is as we're walking around. The Harlem Meer here is partially frozen over. So it's pretty cold as we're walking around. And I'll end the polling now and share those results. Seems like the most popular response is that you're more familiar with Central Park's geography than the average visitor. So if that's the case, you should check out those maps and test yourself. And for those of you that don't explore as much, I'm glad that you're exploring with us today. Cool. And as we're walking further into the park, we will see some beauty. I know the palette of the winter landscape is much earthier and darker. I think it's still very beautiful. And you can see some colors when you look closely, like at this dogwood here, you see this really deep red color. And in addition to the nature that you see in the park, I love the small acts of kindness and humanity you see in the park. And once again, I talk about the history and landscapes a lot, but it really is the people and the energy and the community that they bring that I think just makes cities such a wonderful place. And I just saw someone must have dropped their glove and someone put it up here maybe so they could find it. And I think, as we're all socially distanced and, I'm definitely kind of deprived of some social interaction, I love seeing these small little acts of kindness. I think that's something beautiful about Central Park. And as we survey the landscape from here a bit more, we'll see Fort Clinton up on the right, which is one of the fort sites here in Central Park. And I'm flipping back to Brendan's walk in July here. You can see an image. How stark is this change? It's pretty incredible. Here's the image I took the other day, and here it is in July. Now, I don't want to depress people who are missing the warmer months. That's not my intention, but rather it's just amazing to see an image from the opposite end of the year juxtaposed to the one in January. It's pretty incredible how much the landscape changes. And while we're here talking about Brendan's walk, I wanted to touch on the forts briefly. You can see another map here, one that's not so helpful geographically or not entirely accurate, but it's an image that was created in the 1860s from a book by Benson Lossing, and it details the fort landscape of New York during the War of 1812. And most interesting to us is Fort Fish, which you can see labeled right here. This is before Central Park was created, so the park was not here. Why were there forts here? Well, this area of Manhattan is very rocky and hilly, and then these bluffs sort of drop off into a flat plain and marshland until you reach the Harlem River. And because there were attacks on settlements in Long Island Sound, which you can access through the waterways here, it made sense geographically to fortify these areas. Although there was no fighting here in 1812, but it may interest you to know that during the American War of Independence, the British forces occupied Manhattan for most of the war, and there were fortifications here after they drove out George Washington's army to northern Manhattan. So obviously there's a ton of history there, and we're restricted by time here. I've probably already talked for too long about this, but you can see this beautiful image, this illustration of what it may have looked like, the vantage point from Fort Fish. And without all the buildings in our line of sight, and with fewer trees, you can get a sense that this was a great vantage point. Once again, if you want to dive into the fort history of Central Park more, Brendan's video will be a great resource for that. And so we've walked in the park just a few feet, and I've already managed to go on about 10 different tangents. It's very hard for me not to. But we'll get to a new bit of history here. And if you look up, what will you notice? Well, there's a big ridge here. It might look like a big rock. We have a lot of big boulders in Central Park, but we're going to take a closer look at this ridge in the background here and notice that it's a bit different than all the other ones. We'll also see a man here looking at a plaque. We're going to take a closer look at that plaque too, because what it will tell us about this landscape is that these were the buildings that we saw on the map before. This Mount St. Vincent site, which was built in 1847. It was basically a campus well, there's some religious buildings here, and it was one of the first sites in New York dedicated to the higher education of women. So it's historically significant in that regard as well. But because Central Park was being built beginning in 1858, eventually this group left to found Mount St. Vincent, which is still in Riverdale, which is in the Bronx a few miles away. These buildings, what happened to them? Well, for a brief time, they were administrative buildings for the park commissioners. Apparently, Frederick Law Olmsted lived here with his family. He's the designer of Central Park, if you don't know. And that's according to his biographer, one of his biographers. Here you can get a better illustration of these images of these buildings in 1861. They were also a Civil War hospital from 1861 to 1865. And eventually they became sort of a hangout, apparently, for wealthier clientele until these buildings burned down in 1881. So that's why they're gone. You can see them here as, I mean, they're pretty large buildings. So there's something that stand out definitely because we have, besides the Metropolitan Museum of Art and the Arsenal, these are probably the largest buildings that were in Central Park. And on the site where these buildings once stood, we can take a closer look at that ridge that you may have walked by before and thought was just another big rock. You can actually see it's a stone wall. So definite signs of human development here. It's because there were buildings here for a long time. And if we go up above that wall on this ridge, you can see just how much the elevation changes. We get a great view of the Upper East Side over here, East Harlem. And if you do come up here and climb, just be careful because it's pretty steep. But it's probably one of the best places to replicate a hiking experience in Central Park. And so walking around here, you'll see on the map we're going to the Mount, which is the composting site. And I assume, I haven't seen anything, but I assume that the Mount is really just a reference to Mount St. Vincent. But today it's where we do our composting. You'll also get a good view of the Conservatory Garden up here, which is sort of like an outdoor botanical garden. Really beautiful place to visit. I think it's one of New York's best kept secrets because it's a free garden. And at one point, this even had greenhouses on it. So this is another thing that was lost that you may not have known about. These greenhouses were here in 1905, or at least that's when this image from the Museum of the City of New York is dated to. But in the 1930s, we got the current Conservatory Garden. And walking further, we get to this big, unsightly pile of compost. May not be the prettiest sight to look at, but it's very important for the upkeep of Central Park. And I think it's really cool how our operations are pretty sustainable because we're taking all the leaf litter and other organic materials up here to break down and later be used to enrich the soil of the park. And it's funny because what was once here, after those buildings we talked about burned down, was another upscale establishment called McGowan's Pass Tavern. There was a tavern here actually in the 1700s as well. But this one, which was built in 1883 or 1884, I've seen both dates, and lasted until 1917, was sort of like a hotel slash restaurant and bar that, from what I can tell, had similar, or there was a similar sentiment towards it as another building in the park, which was called the Casino, which was a restaurant, and that it appealed to kind of the upper echelon of New York society. And there was also Maybe not so much as in this one. I know in the casino there was a kind of popular sentiment that it's like a place of corruption. Maybe this one didn't have the same connotations. It's sort of what I picked up from reading about it, but nevertheless, it was like this really kind of swanky hangout, and it's a really beautiful building that was here. And it's kind of funny that today it's just this work site. You can actually get a really great view of Midtown from here as well. So I think that's what stands out to me about the northern section of the park. In the winter, especially without the leaves on the trees, you get some really great views of the city where you can see for miles. And I'm sorry if I'm coming really fast here. I just want to get through it because I recognize I'm probably taking up too much time. But as we walk further, we're going to approach Fort Fish, which is our marquee destination today, and we will see this sign to the northwoods. You could go right at this fork and go into the woods. We're going to go left and go up to Fort Fish, and I'm going to do another one of these time travel pictures here, and we can see this site in July. Really astounding to me just how much greenery affects the space that you're in. I mean, it definitely makes the park, I don't know, I think it makes it feel bigger because your line of sight is so restricted when the, trees and shrubs are all green, and you feel maybe a bit more confined when you're walking through the woods here. In the winter here, it feels a lot more open, and you can see for miles at some points. There still is some greenery up here. There's some great conifers up here. And yeah, you can see again in the summer just how different it is. We are going to get now to the last bit of history I'm going to share with you. It's very important, though. It's a bench, a memorial that recognizes one of the most important figures in New York City history, and that is Andrew Haswell Green. Maybe you've heard of him, maybe you haven't. It's surprising to me, based on his stature, that this is one of the few memorials to him in New York. There is a park in the Upper East Side that was recently added, I think just in the last decade, that bears his name. But Andrew Haswell Green was a lawyer by trade who became a prominent city figure. He was on the Central Park Board of Commissioners, where he became the comptroller and president. And he was a reform politician, and sometimes he was at odds with the designers, Calvert Vaux and Frederick Law Olmsted. But as a testament to how hard of a worker Andrew Haswell Green was, Olmsted, it sort of had an antagonistic relationship to him at some points, just because Olmsted was a visionary designer, and Andrew Haswell Green was controlling the purse for Central Park, and so at times they were at odds. Even Frederick Law Olmsted said that Andrew Haswell Green did more work, something along the lines, he did more work than the other commissioners, times 100. So he was really important and instrumental to the creation of Central Park. And we began our walk at East 106th Street. And actually, that's where the original limits to the park were. The park was going to go from 59th Street to East 106th Street. Andrew Haswell Green was actually instrumental in buying the land between 106 and 110th Street, which added over 60 acres to the park. So not insignificant, and we can thank Andrew Haswell Green for that. Here's an image of him, actually. He had a very accomplished career. Other highlights would be that he was the comptroller of New York City in the 1870s, and probably his most significant contribution to New York would be being kind of the figurehead of the movement to create New York, or at least New York as we know it today. New York City until the 1890s was Manhattan and parts of the Bronx or Westchester County that were annexed. After decades long push, Andrew Haswell Green helped lead the movement to consolidate the entire metropolitan area into the city we know today, and increase the land area of New York City like 4 or 5 times. So hugely significant. I'm sorry I'm breezing over this. I mean, it's like a massive story that I can't flesh out, but if you haven't been here, this is a really cool place to visit. You can come here, reflect on whatever you'd like, maybe on New York, and there are 5 maple trees planted behind it that are supposed to represent the 5 boroughs. And I would add, it's also, I've sat in all the benches at Central Park, in Central Park pretty much, all the types of benches at least, and this might be the most comfortable. So come check it out. It's a cool place to visit. You'll also get good views of Harlem from up on this promontory. And as we near the end of our walk, I just wanted to reflect on the seasons a bit more. You can see these changes here. And for our last stop, I wanted to look at this ginkgo tree that Brendan said was his favorite tree in the park. So in honor of Brendan, I wanted to end here and look at it. You can see, this is probably the talking point that I've touched on the most in my walks, is just how cool I think the trees are in the winter, because you can really see their shape. You can see it in the summer back in July, and you can see it in the fall as well. So Central Park is always changing. No matter if you've been here 1,000 times, there's still going to be new things to see. And I'm so glad that you were able to join us to see a few new things today. So thank you so much for joining us. If you'd like to recreate the walk, you can do so here, or you can take a look at my route and try to memorize it or take a picture of it. Once again, the mount is a work site, a composting site. You might not want to walk through there. It's very hilly, but you can follow the paths up to Fort Fish and you'll get those awesome vantage points. So take a look at this. If you're not able to get to the park, then I'm glad I was able to bring it to you. And thank you once again for joining us. I can be very long-winded, but I hope that you enjoyed it and I hope that you learned something new. So please check out our other programming that my colleagues are dropping links for. Thank you for supporting us by joining us for these programs. It means a lot to us, the Conservancy, and it means a lot to me to get to share something I love with all of you. So you can visit our website. You can see the URL here if you'd like to access resources like the Zoom background I'm using now, or maybe you want to share your story on our website and maybe end up on one of those banners that we put up in the park if you'd like. You can also go to our YouTube page to watch older videos, and if you were wanting more detail about the fort landscape, once again, you can go watch Brendan's video. He'll go into that history in more detail. So thank you. I think that's all the announcements I had to do. And we look forward to seeing you next week for our walk to Seneca Village. So from the Central Park Conservancy, stay safe and be well.